So for those of you who are familiar with SeaChoice, this is probably what you think of when you think of us. Either finding us on seafood packs as you're perusing grocery stores looking for sustainable seafood options, or running into us at various seafood events around town like the Spot Prawn Festival and so on. Spoiler alert, we don't do this anymore, and that's what we're here to talk to you about and explain why it is we moved away from this. But first, a little bit of SeaChoice history. So SeaChoice was founded originally by 5 NGOs in 2006, and the focus was really on using retailer leverage and consumer buying power to reform seafood production, fisheries, and aquaculture. And we employed what's known as a markets-based approach with direct retail partnerships in which we worked with retailers and suppliers to improve their seafood procurement and shift it more towards sustainable options. But we also did a lot of consumer outreach to try and increase the demand for sustainable seafood. And at the heart of our program was the ranking system developed by the Seafood Watch program run out of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And this is where seafood is ranked on a traffic light, a 3-tiered system. You have green, which is a best choice, yellow, which is some concerns, or red, which is avoid. And in this case, seafood is assessed for its environmental performance, so not social, but environmental performance against established protocols for either fisheries and aquaculture. And actually, you see up here that Seafood Watch actually calls yellow a good alternative, but we actually felt that some concerns was a better term for this, because you can see that even Seafood Watch admits that the yellow seafood has concerns with how they're caught or farmed. So Seafood Watch calls it a good alternative, but SeaChoice called it some concerns. So in the 10 plus years we worked with our direct retail partnerships, we did see significant improvements in the environmental sustainability of their seafood procurement. For example, this graph here demonstrates the change in the percent of their procurement that was either red ranked or unranked. And you see it really did decrease quite significantly over the decade. We also saw great improvements in the transparency with the retailers we worked. They were very transparent, announcing how much of their seafood didn't meet their commitment. And also they really increased their education for consumers, having extensive education and point of sale programs in store. So this is the aggregate retailer data for our retailers from 2015, and it showed you that about 8.7% or 9% of the volume procured at that point was red ranked for their fresh and frozen seafood. And 23 was best choice, but the vast majority was in this yellow category of some concerns. And this seemed to be staying this way. There's definitely an attitude out there among retailers anyway and suppliers that yellow is good enough. You know, yellow or green are what we're aiming for. The red we want to avoid. So at this point in our program, a decade in, it seemed like the right time to take stock and figure out whether the program was making a real difference on the water, and if not, why not? Were we on the best path to achieving what we were trying to achieve, or was it time to shift course? And so to answer these important questions, we undertook this report called Taking Stock, in which we looked at the state of Canada's seafood supply. The study had 3 goals: to determine the sustainability of Canada's seafood, to determine the sources of the unsustainable seafood, and to find the next steps on improving the sustainability of seafood sold in Canada, whether it was produced or imported. The report found this for the overall seafood production. So again, kind of reflecting what we saw with our retailers. Most of it was in the yellow category with some concerns, with about equal proportions of best choice and or avoid. The main problematic seafood being produced in Canada was BC open net pen farm salmon, followed by Atlantic cod, Atlantic hake, rockfish, some of the freshwater fisheries in Manitoba lakes, though those were obviously, as you can see, much less in terms of volume. In terms of the seafood being imported into Canada, the 3 big red ranked or avoid categories were farm tropical shrimp, farm salmon again, open net pen farm salmon, and caught skipjack tuna. But this was really interesting. We actually found that a great deal of the seafood being imported into Canada was imported as fish NES, which means not elsewhere specified. We actually don't know what species these fish are, and therefore have no idea what their sustainability ranking is. So this is obviously a great challenge with our imports. So this shows the sustainability trade balance from the report, showing you the production, so the seafood produced in Canada, our imports, our exports, and the balance, the trade balance. And again, we're seeing this, overall pattern that most of the seafood that is available for Canadians to eat is in the yellow category, though there's still a good deal of red, and in fact, if you see the balance, it's more than the green. And what's really interesting from this graph is you see that Canada actually exports its sustainable seafood to then import unsustainable options in its place, which is a bit of a challenge. So our conclusion from this report was that there really were significant sustainability deficiencies remaining in Canada's seafood marketplace. There was still a lot of work remaining. There was a lot of seafood available in Canada that's red ranked. We really needed to work on reducing the amount of yellow seafood and working with those that really had a lot of environmental sustainability concerns that need addressing, and deal with this fact that we're exporting our sustainable options and importing unsustainable in its place. So to solve these problems, So to solve these problems, it was clear we actually did need to change course, that we weren't going to keep getting changes that we wanted if we stayed the course we were on. And one of these reasons was that although our retailers were performing pretty well, we actually only had 3 retailers of retailers available in Canada. The rest of them were partnered with either other NGOs or were acting independently. And we'd really made the progress we could with our retailers. But what we needed was to aggregate the retailer leverage across Canada, so to really get all of the retailers moving. We also needed to start looking elsewhere on the supply chain. Consumer demand was clearly not going to solve all the sustainability challenges we had with the seafood available in Canada. We needed to work with producers, with suppliers, and especially with the government. So in 2017, we completely changed our program, and we transitioned to become Canada's leading sustainable seafood watchdog. And this just kind of is our rationale for why the change. And I've kind of already talked about some of this. We saw diminishing returns for our efforts with retailers, which were a lot of work, to be honest, to maintain those relationships. Our retailers individually had very small leverage as individual companies. There was limited capacity across the country with ENGOs to work on the reform work that was needed, so we felt like we should be contributing to some of that. And there was a need to aggregate nationwide market leverage, especially to get rid of the red ranked or unranked seafood. So we no longer rank seafood, and we no longer show up at all the events to do a lot of consumer education. We've completely shifted course. What do we do now? Well, we have 4 main work streams at the moment. Priority species, which are species with sustainability challenges for which we're seeking focused solutions. Eco-labels, which are our engagement with certifications, rankings, and claims to ensure they remain credible. Labeling and traceability, in which we're trying to improve the traceability and transparency of the seafood sold in Canada. And seafood progress, which is how we've aggregated the retailer leverage, in which we track and advance retailer commitments to sustainable seafood. So I'm going to touch really briefly on the first of these 2, and then Liane's going to take you into a bit of a deeper dive into the others. But we are here for lunch after, and would be really happy to talk about any of this work. Just quickly, in terms of our structure, we're now a partnership of 3 NGOs, the David Suzuki Foundation, the Ecology Action Center, which is based in Nova Scotia in Halifax, and the Living Ocean Society, which has its headquarters as well here in Vancouver. And the oversight is done by a steering committee, which is 1 person from each organization. But then there are other organizational representatives that actually carry out the work, along with Liane here. And then I'm the national manager, so kind of manage the program. And importantly, each of the partner organizations is also a member of the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions. And this is all the leading NGOs working on seafood sustainability in North America, but also now they have NGOs from Europe, from Japan, and I believe Mexico. And so this is really gives us a lot of opportunity to coordinate and communicate what we're trying to achieve and look at what other NGOs are doing and where the gaps are so that we can be a better coordinated movement. And interestingly, this group, this alliance, actually grew out of a debate around BC open net pen farm salmon and whether it was sustainable or not. And that's a whole story I won't get into, but that debate made it clear that all the NGOs working on seafood sustainability really needed to coordinate messaging or at least communicate. And so that was how the alliance was born. So priority species, these are species that enter the Canadian supply chain via fisheries and aquaculture operations that have challenges, either because of ecosystem impacts or because they have low population levels, or indeed we just don't know enough. They're data limited. And our member organizations are really engaged, especially at the management level with these species, advocating for rebuilding plans and also for improving decisions designed to address the reasons that they've been identified as priorities. Now, you can see here most of these are produced in Canada, so most of our priority species on which we focus are produced here. And if any of you work on any of these species, we'd be happy to chat about what we're doing and understand synergies. But we also have started to work on the three most problematic imports into Canada: the farm shrimp, farm salmon that's imported, and skipjack tuna. So the second work stream I want to touch on is our eco-label work. Here we focus on three different eco-label types of eco-labels. And one of the things that's been kind of beneficial about getting out of rankings is that we can now actually watchdog the very rankings that our program was based on before, which is kind of an interesting change in dynamic, but there you have it. So the three types of eco-labels we pay attention to are rankings. So as I mentioned, this is the Seafood Watch program, but also OceanWise, which you may be more familiar with because it's all over Canada now. And it's based also on the Monterey Bay like system, except for they just do recommended or not recommended. So instead of having three categories, they've kind of split the yellow, and everything above is recommended and below is not. There are claims, and these are interesting. These can be really robust, where a company's like, we're 100% sustainable, and you go to their website and it's really clear how they determine that, and then sometimes it's just you have no idea what the claim is based on. And then the third are the eco certifications. And in Canada, the most relevant are the Aquaculture Stewardship Council and the Marine Stewardship Council. So just as some examples of us now watchdogging the system that we were based on before, here's a couple of press releases where we're being very public about our rejection of when Seafood Watch changed yellow BC open net pen farm salmon from red to yellow. And also when they benchmark the Aquaculture Stewardship Council salmon standard as yellow, which de facto makes all ASC certified salmon farms yellow, except for none of them are actually following the salmon standard as written. And so it's very misleading in its messaging, and so we were quite public with that. But most of our focus has actually been on MSC and ASC. And this is actually because we feel they're the most relevant in the Canadian marketplace for getting change on the water. MSC's been here for over a decade, and now over 2/3 of Canada's fisheries by volume are MSC certified. Whereas the ASC in comparison is newer. It's been in Canada for just over 3 years and is certified, but is certifying an ever-growing number of salmon farms. So in this work stream, what we do is we review the practical application of these eco-certifications and in Canada and elsewhere in the world to see, are they actually leading to changes on the water? Are they actually improving the environmental performance of fisheries and farms? And We do this by digging into the data and producing these well-grounded reports. And I don't have time to go into these right now. This could be a whole presentation in itself. The take home is that while both schemes may have been cutting edge or best practice when they began, we're finding that this is no longer the case. And so we've made quite a lot of recommendations for improving the robustness of these eco-certifications that we actually take to the eco-certs and work closely with them to try and implement them. And interesting though, even though we're kind of in the background watchdogging these eco-certifications, we still very much recommend that you buy them. And we very much recommend that our retailers purchase, or that retailers in Canada purchase them. Because of all the eco labels I presented, they are the most robust. They're often a better choice than seafood produced with only in accordance with national laws. They're leaders in terms of transparency, stakeholder engagement, and they're also the only eco labels that have a robust traceability system in place. So you can buy them, and we will continue to make sure that they actually represent the best practice that you think they are. And just in case any of you are interested, our good colleague Curtis Hain, who's the BC or the Western Canada rep for MSC, is here. So that's just proof that we still get along, even though we're watchdogging them. And I'm sure he'd be really happy. He's going to join the lunch after and would be really happy to talk MSC if any of you are working on that or have any questions. So that is it for my half of the presentation. I'm now going to pass it over to Liane, who's going to take you into a bit of a deeper dive onto our two other work streams.
As Sarah said, I'm going to talk a bit more about our labeling and traceability work, focusing on what I've termed the 5 whats. What's the problem? What are we doing? What are the results have we had? What's the wider context? And what are we going to do next? So to start with the problem, Canada actually has really lax seafood labeling laws. Not sure whether any of you have looked into this, but under current regulations, consumers generally don't know what species they're eating, what country it came from, and whether their purchases could be contributing to environmental degradation or human rights abuses. For seafood that's produced in Canada, the only regulation is that there's a common name on pack, and for seafood that's imported, you need to have a common name and the product, the country it's a product of, which is not where it's been produced. So you can see on the left here, the report that led to all these findings that have underpinned all our later work on labeling and traceability, called Canadians Eating in the Dark. And on the right, you can see a comparison of Canada's labeling regulations as compared to our 2 major seafood trading partners, the European Union and the US. And you can see how many more elements of labeling are required by those administrations. Canada's not doing great. This is what those translate to on seafood packs. So on the left-hand side, you can see the an EU label. So you've got the common name, scientific name. It says whether it's wild or farmed. It says the gear or harvest method on it. Tells you where it's caught, as well as the country it's a quote-unquote product of. So in Canada, that same product could be sold with just rockfish. So we think it's time for Canadians to stop eating seafood in the dark and start benefiting from some better seafood labeling. So the kind of administrative and legal framework for seafood labeling in Canada is based on the Canadian Food Inspection Agency fish list, which outlines recommended common or market names for seafood sold in Canada. This will apply to all retailers, but there's a little bit of ambiguity about whether it applies to restaurants, which is something to keep in mind. On the left here, you can see an example of what this fish list looks like. And on the right, one of the problems we found with the fish list, which is that one common name can apply to many, many different species. And we'll talk about some of the implications of that in a little bit. But just to look more closely at one example of this, so rockfish. There's 28 species in the genus Sebastes listed on the fish list. Of those 28, 10 species can be called Pacific snapper, but 18 can't. All 28 species could be called rockfish, but apparently consumers don't like that, and retailers, when they start using the term rockfish, see a drop in consumers buying it. And 4 species in the genus have 6 acceptable common names in English only and more in French. So it gets quite confusing about knowing what it is you're actually buying. So what's the solution? What has SeaChoice been doing? Well, there's been 2 main opportunities for legal reform in the last couple of years. The first one is the Safe Food for Canadians regulation, which came out in June. Sorry, regulations. I think it's a bunch of related ones. And its main purpose is to make sure that Canadians' food is safe. Interestingly, these regulations, which are meant to make Canadians feel more secure about the food that they're buying, doesn't address simple questions like, what are you eating? What species is it? How was it made? Where did it come from? But it does contain, you'll be relieved to note, assurances such as, and I quote, light meat tuna has a diffuse luminous reflectance of not less than 22.6 of that of magnesium oxide. You can all sleep easy at night knowing that your light meat tuna is not shiny. So in the end, and despite our best efforts, these regulations really fall short and don't introduce improved seafood labeling or mandate full chain traceability. The traceability that they mandate is just to allow for product recalls in case there's something, some sort of shellfish poisoning or something. So there is another legal opportunity available to us right now. It's the really catchily named Food Labeling Modernization Initiative, which just rolls off the tongue. And it aims to streamline labeling across all products, but with a focus on health and safety. So while SeaChoice has been fighting to get more specific labeling requirements for seafood, this regulation is actually going in the complete opposite direction and trying to make sure that all food across Canada has kind of minimum legal requirements. So we're still going to work to try and get some more detailed guidance for seafood that will be specific to the challenges of seafood and that we've already kind of touched on. Lots of common names, lots of species, lots of confusion. And we're expecting to see the final legislative proposal this spring. So that's the kind of legal context, and it's not looking great, which is why SeaChoice has more and more been looking at voluntary improvements and why we continue to work with retailers on seafood labeling, because we know that we're very unlikely to get improved seafood labeling laws in the near future, so the kind of voluntary approach has become even more critical. So perhaps it's a good time to talk about why poor labeling is a problem. Well, we think that consumers should be able to easily find out what animal they're eating and how it was produced, because this has significant implications for how sustainable it is and potentially what sort of risks there are in terms of human rights abuses and other labor abuses that might have gone into its production. Better labeling also produces better transparency and accountability at the retail level, because for you to have the information at point of sale, it has to travel with that fish all the way from the point of production. So better accountability. Also, our main seafood trade partners have that information, so why don't we? Why does the seafood that's produced in Canada get sold in other jurisdictions with far more information on the labels, but we don't benefit from that? Finally, there's lots of research that confirms consumers trust brands that are transparent, so there's kind of a business case for it. And another business case is that storied seafood sells. People like hearing about who's making their food and where it's come from. So when we kind of work, we want to find out, do we care about this, or is it just us? So we partnered with EcoAnalytics to do a survey in 2017 that spoke to 3,000 Canadians and found that over 80% of them agreed that all seafood sold in Canada should be labeled with information that identifies the species, where it was caught, and how it was caught. We kind of leapfrogged on that and ran a petition that we delivered to the government that was almost 13,000 signatures from Canadians who wanted better labeling for their seafood. And then we thought, well, what else can we do if the kind of legal reforms is not proving a really great avenue? So we decided to recruit citizen scientists from across Canada to help us run a huge seafood labeling study to see what is the level of seafood labeling across Canada, kind of from coast to coast and top to bottom. And we partnered with the Life Scanner program at the University of Guelph. We had over 1,000 people register their interest, and in the end we chose 300. And those 300 participants sent us 500 samples from 49 supermarkets. And they included information like what information was on the labels of the seafood they bought. They sent us pictures of it. They collected little samples of DNA using the kit you can see in the picture, which they sent to Life Scanner for DNA sequencing. And so this would allow us to get a really good idea of what the current level of seafood labeling was across Canada. Specifically, we were looking at the common name, which we've already discussed, the scientific name because it gives much greater clarity as to what the product actually is. The geographic origin, so where was this actually caught or produced, as well as where was it processed. We also looked at the hows, so was it wild or farmed, and which, in terms of those different types of production, what's the gear type that it was caught with or farming method that produced it. And this is because all of these questions have a really significant impact on how sustainable the product is. And consumers who are trying to use information that is put out by organizations like SeaChoice or Seafood Watch or OceanWise, to figure out what is yellow or green or recommended or not recommended, you need all of this information in order to make that decision. So what did we find? In 2017, this was the spread of labeling quality we found across Canada. So depending on how much information was on the pack, we assigned samples a score of A to D, with A being good. And then we also had a class for mislabeled products. So what does that look like? So you can see on the left here a grade A seafood label, which has the scientific name, where it was caught, how it was caught. And this makes us happy. We want to see more of this, especially because they're also showing you can do it in English and French. In contrast, we have a D grade seafood label on the right, which has the very informative cod fillets. We want to see less of this. Generally across Canada, these are the results we found in 2017. Very few products with scientific name or gear type or farming method. A few more indicating the country of harvest, so the geographic origin of the product. A few more giving the country of processing, although that's kind of a legal requirement only for imported seafood, so that might be skewing that result a little bit. Almost 60% said whether it was farmed or wild caught. But interestingly, they're much more likely to say it if it's wild caught. And 93% had an accurate common name as judged by matching the CFIA fish list recommendations. So that was labeling quality. We're going to talk now a little bit about labeling accuracy, which is it what the label said it was? Are they using the correct common name? So the first category of labeling accuracy we're going to talk about is mislabeling. So that name doesn't match the recommended common name on the fish list, but it's not judged to be misleading or untruthful. So an example for this would be a product labeled snapper instead of Pacific snapper. It is still snapper. It's close to the right common name. It's not great. We want that to be improved, but it's arguably not being misleading. Contrast this with a common name that doesn't match the fish list and seems to be misleading or untruthful, like something labeled as cod that's actually pollock, and it's kind of a different story. That seems a bit more deliberate. So we talk about either fraud or species substitutions. Species substitution kind of allow for, it might have been an accident. Fraud implies a deliberate intent to deceive, usually for monetary gain. And fraud can be quite difficult to, well, SeaChoice is quite conservative with its use of fraud because it's really hard to determine intent. Did you mean to make this mistake? And where in the supply chain did this mistake occur? Because it's very well likely might not have been the retailer that made the mistake. They get a shipment of fish in. It says it's one thing. They're like, okay, they label it. We do the DNA sampling, and it turns out it was something else. So, accuracy from our first study found 7% mislabeling, and only 20% of that 7% were deemed species substitutions, so about 1% of our overall samples. So it's not as widespread as some other, our results don't show it's as widespread as some other studies, but that's still not good enough, and we want to see it improved. In 2018, we ran a similar citizen science experiment, but we restricted the number of products that people looked at to products labeled as cod, sole, shrimp, snapper or rockfish, and wild salmon. And we also restricted the supermarkets they could sample from. So we were only looking at stores owned by Canada's 7 biggest retailers. Here's our kind of results from that. So the labeling quality, you can see on the left how many products had those pieces of information on them. Again, not very many showing the scientific name or the gear type or harvest method. Again, about 60% indicating farmed or wild caught, mostly wild. And on the right, you can see our kind of scoring breakdown. So the A, B, C, the good, okay, unsatisfactory, poor, and mislabeled. And the rate of mislabeling was about the same, 6%. So to kind of come back to the other studies that you may have read about, our results are quite different from what you may have seen in the news. Our colleagues at Oceana Canada have been running a seafood fraud campaign for the last couple of years as well. They reported 44% sampling, mislabels of their samples. We have been working with them and trying to figure out why they found 44% and we found 7%. And I think a lot of it comes down to a different sampling frame. So they looked far more at restaurants than at retailers. You can see in the bottom left hand there the number of restaurants versus retailers that they looked at. And they also were looking at different products than we were generally looking at. So they were looking at ones known to have high levels of mislabeling from previous studies. And the ones they found are in the top right there, the fish name on the label menu, generally high value products that are sold generally in smaller quantities in Canada. But they still found among retailers 22% of mislabeling. And some of that difference, again, will come down to our different definitions of mislabeling. So Oceana counted samples as mislabeled if the species scientific name wasn't on CFIA, whereas we interpret that as, well, there's no recommended guidance for that species, therefore, is it misleading or untruthful? If not, you get a score for a correct labeling. Although we did, keep track of all the species we found that weren't on the fish list, and we'll be submitting those to CFIA to add because there should be a recommended common name for them. There's also another really interesting study that came out recently that looked at mislabeling throughout the supply chain. So both our study and SeaChoice's Oceana's study looked at labeling at the end of the supply chain, whereas this study looked at different points in the supply chain. So at point of import, at point of processing, distribution, and final sale. And they found an overall mislabeling rate of 32%, so still pretty high. Their targeted commodities are listed at the bottom. Again, generally high-value species where there's a strong economic incentive to mislabel. This is quite interesting. This is from that same study. So the common names in yellow are names that are not listed on the fish list as acceptable market names. And the ones highlighted in blue are the scientific names for species that are not listed on the fish list. Now, one of the problems for this is that the fish list is frequently using outdated taxonomic scientific names, which makes this all more complicated. So you have to look back at what was the, when we get the DNA sequences, we have to look back at what other things has this species gone by and look at the whole kind of taxonomic history of it. And frequently we find that the species is on CFIA just under a different taxonomic name. So it's really good fun all around. Talking a little bit more about the other types of problems we found on the fish list. The first scenario is when you have one common name that applies to a bunch of different species, or alternatively, you can have one species that's known by a bunch of different common names. And the implications of this are, there's 14 different species that can be called tuna. One of them is the Atlantic bluefin tuna, which is endangered. The other is skipjack, which is least concern and the second biggest fishery worldwide. They can both be known as tuna. And how are you going to know which one you're buying? Actually, they would say it's bluefin tuna because they can get way more money for it. But the point still stands that tuna have very different sustainability ratings, but they can all just be called tuna. To look at scenario 2, the long-spine thorny head, which is one of the rockfish species caught off the coast of BC here, has 4 common names on the CFIA fish list, including the colorful idiot fish. I'm not sure where they got that from. These common names can also apply to 1 other species, in this case, 9 other species for rosefish, 11 other species for Pacific snapper, and 19 other species that can go by rockfish. Yet this one is listed as special concern under COSAWIC. So it's a way of kind of slipping species with conservation concerns into the supply chain, whereas people might not buy them if they knew what species it was. Finally, we're also looking to get more guidance on country of origin. So here's a seafood pack sold in Canada. It says it's Pacific salmon, pink salmon, product of China. And that's because even though it was probably caught off the coast of BC or Alaska, it was sent to China for filleting, it's re-imported to Canada as a product of China. Not very helpful in knowing where it is, where it was actually caught, which is important for the kind of sustainability aspect of it. So that kind of wraps up our labeling and traceability. We have a few minutes left to talk about seafood progress, which is one of the ways that we're engaging with retailers to improve some of the issues that we've talked about. So we're going to quickly blitz through the 5 whats for seafood progress, starting with, as Sarah said, after 10 years of retail partnership, SeaChoice found every retailer had a policy, they were making progress towards it, things were looking pretty positive, except that we hadn't seen those commitments get any stronger, and although some progress towards the commitments had been made, their impact on the water was really difficult to determine. So we decided to come up with Seafood Progress, which would be an online tool to facilitate retailer transparency and accountability. Its main goals are to facilitate business transparency, incentivize continual improvement in commitments and procurement, and provide businesses with recommendations and resources to broaden their commitments and move closer towards achieving them. Here's what it looks like. You can find it on seafoodprogress.org. These are the retailers that we profiled in our first round. They're Canada's 9 biggest retailers by number of stores and kind of geographic spread. When you look at a retailer's profile, this kind of summary of their score across 6 different steps. They're based on the Conservation Alliance's common vision. And each of those 6 steps is gone into in more detail. If you click on the heading, it compares their score to the national average, so the average of all the retailers that we profiled. Each step is made up of 3 to 5 step elements, or I kind of think of these as key performance indicators. And again, it gives that retailer score compared to the national average. It tells you more information about why they got that score. And it kind of gives you this nice rainbow scoring rubric of what the color they have matches up with in terms of their score. So we launched it in June of last year. What we found was that retailers were generally doing pretty well on steps 1 to 3. So they generally had pretty detailed commitments. They were generally collecting data to support those commitments, and they were more or less sourcing in line with those commitments. So that's those 3 steps. However, they generally scored a lot more poorly on steps related to transparency, education, and supporting improvements of seafood products that have sustainability challenges associated with them. So we encourage you to go and check out your retailer and see how they scored on their seafood policy. Just to give this a little bit of a similar context, like we did with labeling, Greenpeace has been running a similar study in the US for 10 years. But they take a different approach where they rank retailers from best to worst. In NGO shorthand, this is called the rank and spank because it allows good actors to be recognized, but more importantly, it calls out the poorest performers and can lead to considerable public pressure to improve. We decided not to go that route with Seafood Progress because we're mostly judging retailers against their own commitment, not against standards that we're imposing on them. So it would have they're not as comparable as the Greenpeace ranking. Also, the Conservation Alliance that Sarah mentioned is looking at a similar initiative to Seafood Progress, but this would be at the global scale. So they're looking at whether it would be effective or even possible to create a similar platform to Seafood Progress that would look at the world's largest buyers and sellers of seafood around the globe in both developed and developing markets. That'll be really exciting. In terms of next steps, we have developed recommendation reports for all the retailers with 4 or 5 things that we think they should work on over the next year to improve their procurement and also their score. We're focusing on things like having detailed and publicly available commitments to source more socially responsible seafood, to report the amount of seafood that is meeting their commitment, and to have a policy that requires more pieces of information to be on their seafood label across the board. So that about wraps it up. I hope that you found the history of SeaChoice and its strategy for creating positive changes on the water interesting. You can find more information about everything that Sarah and I have talked about today on seachoice.org. Alternatively.